The moment Pearl Moore pressed her mouth against a stranger's, she was not chasing desire, romance, or recklessness. She was escaping collapse. Everything around her had been seconds away from unraveling. The room was filled with quiet power rather than noise, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly but ruled silently through ownership, influence, and unspoken hierarchies. Pearl had been standing at the edge of that invisible battlefield, watching her family's fragile dignity wobble under scrutiny it could not survive. Eyes had begun to narrow. Calculations were already forming. Judgment was moving faster than mercy. She reacted before thought could interfere. "Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue." Her hand closed around the sleeve of the nearest man whose presence felt immovable. Without hesitation, without permission, she rose onto her toes and sealed her panic against his mouth. It was instinct disguised as courage, a gamble fueled by fear. Cameras shifted, attention redirected. The moment rewrote the narrative instantly. What Pearl did not know was that she had just anchored herself to one of the most unreachable men in that space. Donald Trust had mastered stillness long before wealth multiplied his name. He stood with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. Control had become his default language. The sudden intrusion of a woman claiming his mouth should have offended him. Instead, it intrigued him. He did not pull away. He did not stiffen. He allowed the illusion to breathe. The illusion worked. Speculation shifted away from Pearl's family and locked onto the spectacle she had created. In a single impulsive act, disgrace dissolved into fascination. Pearl withdrew almost immediately, heart pounding, blood roaring, her body buzzing with the weight of what she had just done. She did not look back at the man she used. She did not wait to see his reaction. Survival did not allow curiosity. She disappeared into the crowd, believing the incident would fade into anonymity. Donald watched her go. Not because of the kiss itself, but because of the precision hidden inside her desperation. He recognized calculation masked as chaos. That combination was rare. He stored the memory away without urgency, already aware that nothing attached to him ever remained small. Pearl spent the rest of the evening holding herself together through discipline alone. She carried her posture carefully, aware that scrutiny could resurface at any moment. Her family regained breathing room. Conversations shifted. The crisis dissolved quietly, as if it had never existed. Relief arrived too late to soften the tremor inside her chest. She told herself it was over. It was not. By morning, the image had circulated far beyond the room where it happened. Analysts speculated. Social circles whispered. Financial commentators drew connections that did not yet exist. A stranger's kiss had evolved into a symbol of alignment, of association, of approval. Pearl woke to messages she did not answer and questions she refused to acknowledge. Her name had become attached to Donald Trust without consent. Donald, on the other hand, woke to certainty. He reviewed the footage once, not for pleasure but for confirmation. The woman's body language confirmed everything his instincts had suggested. She had not been hunting attention. She had been cornered. He respected corners. He understood what people did when walls closed in. Instead of erasing the moment, he allowed it to remain visible. That choice shifted everything. Pearl attempted to resume normalcy. She returned to routines that now felt misaligned. Ordinary movement clashed with extraordinary attention. The weight of association pressed against her private life, demanding explanations she refused to provide. Her silence only sharpened interest. Donald did not contact her immediately. Power did not rush. Power observed. He initiated quiet inquiries instead. Not invasive, not reckless. He learned enough to understand her motivations without violating her privacy. What he discovered only deepened his curiosity. Pearl Moore was not chasing elevation. She had been protecting something fragile. That distinction mattered. When their paths crossed again, It was not by accident. Pearl sensed him before she saw him. His presence carried a density that altered space. When she turned and recognized the stranger she had kissed, the realization struck her with delayed intensity. This was not a man who drifted through moments. This was someone who curated outcomes. She felt exposed. Donald acknowledged her existence with calm restraint. There was no accusation in his expression, no demand, no visible claim. That absence unsettled her more than confrontation would have. She had expected consequences. Instead, she encountered possibility. Their interaction remained brief, controlled, and unremarkable on the surface. Yet beneath that restraint, an invisible thread tightened. Something had been initiated that could not be undone by politeness or distance. Pearl walked away aware that her impulsive decision had not concluded when her lips left his. It had only shifted form. Donald watched her leave with deliberate patience. He had no intention of pursuing a woman who did not choose to stay. However, he was fully prepared to reposition the circumstances that had forced her hand in the first place. The kiss had not meant anything. That was precisely why it meant everything. And somewhere between restraint and inevitability, both of them stood on opposite sides of a future neither had consented to, but neither would escape. What followed that night did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived through quiet rearrangements. Pearl Moore felt it first in the subtle shift of access. Invitations adjusted themselves without explanation. Doors that once required persistence opened with minimal resistance. People who had previously overlooked her now paused, recalculated, and reconsidered. No one spoke directly about the kiss, yet everything moved as though an invisible endorsement hovered over her name. She had not earned it, she had not requested it, and that unsettled her. Donald Trust allowed the aftermath to unfold without interference. Influence did not require announcement. It functioned best when mistaken for coincidence. He watched from a distance, tracking how the environment responded to Pearl's unintentional association with him. Markets responded. Social hierarchies realigned. Strategic minds assumed meaning where none had been stated. That assumption worked in his favor. Donald was accustomed to operating several layers above visible reality. His empire rested on infrastructure, private capital corridors, quiet acquisitions, and leverage that never needed validation. He did not seek admiration. He measured efficiency. Pearl had entered his awareness not as an ornament but as an anomaly, someone whose actions had bent perception without intention. That quality lingered. Pearl attempted to detach herself from the narrative forming around her. She refused to capitalize on the attention. She declined offers that felt opportunistic. She returned to her responsibilities with rigid discipline, hoping consistency would erase speculation. Instead, her restraint sharpened curiosity. People sensed she was not exploiting the situation, which made her more interesting. Donald noticed that too. He finally initiated proximity, not as pursuit but as assessment. Their shared space was not dramatic or charged with confrontation. It was controlled, intentional, and quiet. He observed her composure under pressure, her refusal to perform gratitude, her unwillingness to over-explain. These were not traits learned quickly. They were shaped through necessity. Pearl, in turn, began to understand the scale of the man she had entangled herself with. Donald Trust did not command attention through display. He did so through gravity. Others adjusted themselves around him instinctively. Conversations softened. Movement slowed. Authority did not radiate from him. It settled. She recognized that the kiss had not been a random collision. It had intersected with power dense enough to alter trajectories. Donald did not confront her about the incident. He did not demand clarification or apology. His silence created space, and that space forced Pearl to confront her own awareness. She realized she had been bracing for punishment that never came. Instead, she was being studied. That unsettled her more than judgment would have. Behind Donald's controlled exterior existed a precision shaped by long experience. He understood reputation not as vanity, but as currency. He had spent years insulating his private life from speculation, maintaining boundaries that kept distraction at bay. Pearl's impulsive action had breached that insulation without malice. He should have neutralized the association immediately. He chose not to. That choice was deliberate. He saw utility, yes, but also something less tangible. Pearl carried herself without entitlement. She did not lean into proximity. She did not request protection. That restraint appealed to a man accustomed to transactional interest. It suggested independence rather than ambition. As the days progressed, external pressure intensified. Analysts speculated openly. Rivals took notice. Some attempted to leverage the assumed connection for access. Donald shut those attempts down without explanation. The silence only reinforced the myth. Pearl remained unaware of the quiet battles being waged around her name. Eventually, awareness reached her through consequence rather than information. A situation arose that would have damaged her family irreversibly had circumstances remained unchanged. The outcome shifted unexpectedly in her favor. No explanation followed. No credit was claimed. She knew then that the kiss had evolved into something else. Donald did not intervene directly. He adjusted variables. He redirected influence with surgical restraint. To him, this was not rescue, it was containment. He did not yet know whether Pearl would remain a liability or transform into an asset. That uncertainty kept him attentive. Pearl sensed the protection without understanding its origin fully. Gratitude conflicted with discomfort. She did not like being shielded by forces she could not see. Independence mattered to her. Yet she could not deny the reality. Someone powerful had chosen to intervene without asking for repayment. That imbalance disturbed her equilibrium. Donald observed her reaction carefully. He noted her lack of entitlement. He noted her unease. He noted that she did not attempt to monetize the shift in her favor. These observations solidified his interest. He began to consider structure, ways to formalize influence, limit exposure, and maintain control. Structure always followed disruption. The smile people associated with Donald Trust was not warmth. It was strategy. It disarmed while concealing calculation. Pearl began to understand that behind that expression existed a man who moved outcomes without ever appearing responsible for them. She also began to understand that her life would not return to its previous simplicity. By the time Donald decided the next step was necessary, the environment had already adapted to Pearl's presence within his orbit. Resistance would now draw attention. Silence would no longer suffice. Something needed definition. And as Donald prepared to convert assumption into arrangement, Pearl stood unknowingly at the edge of a decision that would formalize everything the kiss had accidentally set in motion. The stranger she had used for escape was no longer distant. He was preparing to step fully into her reality. Control was never seized abruptly. It was installed gradually, like a system that rewired behavior before anyone noticed the shift. Pearl Moore sensed the recalibration before it became visible. The protection surrounding her had begun to feel structured rather than incidental. Outcomes aligned too cleanly. Obstacles dissolved before they fully formed. The world no longer reacted to her, it adjusted in advance. That level of precision did not exist without intention, and intention always had an owner. She understood then that Donald Trust was no longer observing from the perimeter. He was preparing containment. Donald approached the situation with the same discipline he applied to high-stakes ventures. Undefined proximity created volatility. Volatility attracted interference. Interference threatened privacy. Pearl's continued exposure, unregulated and unsupervised, had become inefficient. If her association with him remained speculative, it would continue to invite distortion. Structure was required. Rather than impose force, he introduced clarity, not publicly, not theatrically, quietly through carefully arranged circumstances that positioned Pearl where refusal would not cost dignity but acceptance would preserve autonomy. She was given space to decide without pressure, which was itself a form of influence. Pearl entered that space with caution sharpened by instinct. She had never been naive about power. She understood that leverage rarely announced itself honestly. Yet she also recognized when choice remained genuine. The environment around her shifted not to trap her, but to invite alignment. That distinction mattered. The arrangement Donald conceptualized was not romantic, nor was it charitable. It was a strategic buffer designed to stabilize speculation, redirect scrutiny, and protect both reputations through controlled visibility. Pearl's presence would anchor perception. His influence would neutralize fallout. Neither would pretend permanence. Neither would exploit vulnerability. What remained unsaid carried the most weight. Pearl evaluated the implications carefully. Accepting structure meant surrendering ambiguity. It meant allowing her image to be curated within parameters she did not design. Yet rejecting it meant returning to chaos, an unregulated narrative capable of harming more than just herself. Independence demanded realism. Reality demanded compromise. She chose engagement without illusion. Donald noted the absence of dramatics in her decision-making. She did not posture. She did not bargain emotionally. She approached the situation with pragmatic restraint, which reassured him. This was not a woman chasing elevation. This was someone managing consequence. The terms that emerged were deliberately minimal: public alignment, select appearances, discretion, mutual respect for boundaries not defined aloud, no emotional obligation, no personal interrogation, no future assumptions. Yet even as the structure settled into place, both parties understood that clarity did not eliminate complexity. It only delayed it. Pearl adjusted to the new rhythm quickly. She learned how visibility functioned when controlled by capital rather than attention. Movement became intentional. Presence became measured. She remained herself within the framework, refusing to become ornamental. Donald noticed and did not interfere. Authenticity stabilized the illusion better than performance ever could. Donald, in turn, recalibrated his private operations. Pearl's integration into his external narrative required insulation elsewhere. He tightened access. He reduced noise. He ensured that no competing interests misinterpreted her role as vulnerability. This was not protection born of attachment. It was maintenance. Still, the dynamic shifted. Time spent in structured proximity revealed details that had nothing to do with obligation. Pearl observed Donald's discipline, his intolerance for inefficiency, his aversion to spectacle. He operated with restraint that bordered on severity. Wealth had not softened him. It had sharpened him. Donald observed Pearl's resistance to dependency. She absorbed advantage without leaning on it. She navigated influence without becoming seduced by it. That balance intrigued him more than compliance would have. The contract stabilized perception, but intensified awareness. External observers interpreted alignment as intimacy. Internally, restraint became its own form of tension. The absence of spoken boundaries forced both parties to self-regulate. Each choice carried consequence. Each restraint amplified curiosity. Pearl found herself aware of Donald's presence in ways unrelated to structure. His silence affected pace. His attention shifted atmosphere. She recognized the danger of that awareness and disciplined herself against it. Donald found himself factoring Pearl into calculations that did not require her presence. That disturbed him. Attachment introduced inefficiency. He corrected course repeatedly, reminding himself of purpose. Yet structure could not eliminate human variables. The arrangement succeeded publicly. Speculation stabilized. Opportunists withdrew. Pressure dissipated. Pearl's family regained equilibrium without debt or exposure. On the surface, the system worked perfectly. Beneath it, something else formed. Not affection, not dependence. Recognition. Both parties understood that the contract was not permanent. It was a temporary architecture built to contain momentum. However, momentum had already developed a direction of its own. Donald sensed that the longer proximity remained controlled, the greater the eventual disruption would be. Pearl sensed that stability had a cost she had not yet calculated. Neither spoke of it. As the structure settled into routine, one truth became increasingly unavoidable. The contract had solved the problem it was designed to contain, but it had introduced a new one neither of them had anticipated. The unspoken terms were no longer passive. They were beginning to assert themselves. And the longer silence held, the louder consequence became. The silence that followed the contract did not feel empty, it felt instructional. Pearl Moore entered the next phase of proximity with heightened awareness. The arrangement had settled, but its implications were only beginning to reveal themselves. Structure had stabilized perception, yet it also exposed her to a sphere governed by unfamiliar rules, rules not enforced through threat or performance, but through quiet consequence. This was not a world that reacted emotionally. It reacted strategically. She began learning without being taught. Donald Trust did not explain his environment. He did not correct her behavior or mold her presence. Instead, he allowed her to observe, to interpret, to adapt independently. That restraint functioned as a test. Those who survived his orbit without instruction were the only ones worth keeping near. Pearl noticed how decisions were never rushed, yet never delayed, how timing functioned as leverage, how patience replaced urgency. She learned that wealth at this level did not announce itself through display, but through insulation, distance from consequence, distance from noise, distance from panic. She adjusted her instincts accordingly. Donald observed her calibration with measured interest. Most people faltered when exposed to unchecked access. Pearl did the opposite. She became more precise. She spoke less. She listened more. She moved with intention rather than eagerness. She did not attempt to dominate space she had not earned. That restraint signaled intelligence. The lessons extended beyond environment. Pearl learned how power disguised itself as courtesy, how refusal could be delivered without friction, how influence moved through channels invisible to outsiders. She saw how Donald navigated resistance without escalation, redirecting momentum rather than confronting it. Control did not rely on dominance. It relied on inevitability. She absorbed these patterns without imitation. Donald noted her refusal to perform transformation. She did not adopt his habits or echo his methods. She remained distinctly herself while understanding his world. That distinction mattered. Adaptation without erasure suggested strength. As weeks passed, Pearl became fluent in the rhythm surrounding Donald without becoming dependent on it. She understood when to appear and when absence carried more weight. She learned that presence was a tool, not a requirement. That lesson reshaped her perception of agency. Donald recognized that she was no longer merely contained by the arrangement. She was operating within it. The realization shifted his internal calculations. The environment responded to Pearl differently now. She was no longer treated as a temporary anomaly or speculative attachment. She was assessed as a constant variable. That shift altered dynamics beyond Donald's immediate control. Her credibility solidified independently of him. That independence unsettled him. Donald had built his empire on predictability. Variables were managed, outcomes anticipated. Pearl's evolution introduced an element he could not fully model. She was not reacting as expected. She was neither overwhelmed nor consumed. She was expanding. That expansion carried risk. Pearl sensed the tension subtly. She recognized moments when Donald's attention lingered longer than necessary, not with desire but with evaluation. She understood that growth within proximity could be interpreted as threat. Power tolerated usefulness. It resisted autonomy. She adjusted carefully, not shrinking, not challenging but maintaining equilibrium. The lessons continued through exposure rather than instruction. Pearl observed how loyalty functioned as currency, how discretion held more value than enthusiasm, how silence could preserve advantage better than assertion. She learned that alignment did not require surrender, but it demanded awareness. Donald continued to provide access without endorsement. He did not elevate her publicly beyond necessity. He did not shield her excessively. He allowed her to navigate complexity independently, prepared to intervene only if containment failed. That restraint was deliberate. Pearl began to understand that Donald's trust did not rescue, he assessed. Intervention occurred only when outcomes threatened efficiency. That understanding reframed her perception of his earlier actions. Protection had never been personal, it had been strategic. Yet strategy did not explain everything. There were moments, brief, unguarded, when Donald's composure softened without intention, when fatigue replaced precision, when control loosened slightly at the edges. Pearl noticed those moments and did not exploit them. She recognized vulnerability when she saw it. Respect demanded restraint. Donald noticed her restraint. The mutual awareness created tension that neither acknowledged. It existed beneath structure, beneath intention, beneath reason. It was not emotional. It was not romantic. It was the friction that arises when two self-governing forces occupy adjacent space. The arrangement had become more than containment. Pearl realized that remaining static within this world would require conscious effort. Growth occurred naturally in environments built for expansion. She would either evolve further or retreat intentionally. Passive presence was no longer possible. Donald realized that continued proximity without redefinition risked destabilization. The lessons Pearl was absorbing were altering her trajectory. That trajectory would soon intersect with interests beyond his control. Neither acted immediately. They existed within a narrow window where equilibrium still held. The silence between them thickened, no longer neutral, no longer passive. It carried weight. It carried implication. Pearl understood that her education in this world was nearing completion. She had learned what she needed. The next lesson would not be observational. It would be experiential. Donald understood that structure alone could not sustain what had begun. The contract had created order. The lessons had created capability. The next phase would require decision. As the unspoken tension settled into permanence, both recognized the same truth from opposite ends of power. The world Pearl was learning to navigate would soon demand a price. And the first cost would be boundaries. The night arrived without fanfare, yet it carried weight heavier than daylight had ever allowed. Pearl Moore had grown accustomed to precision and restraint, yet this evening rendered both obsolete. Structure had framed her interactions for weeks, yet one sequence of events would dissolve the artificial walls she had carefully maintained. Boundaries, so long respected, began to falter in the presence of proximity ungoverned by oversight. It began with context, not intention. Donald Trust had arranged an environment calibrated to subtle influence, not spectacle. Candles flickered against walls of glass that revealed nothing but the night beyond, and the air carried temperature moderated to enhance clarity rather than comfort. Pearl moved within it with measured poise, but the shifts in rhythm, the pauses, the attentions, the silent observations were unfamiliar. She recognized that every gesture, every movement, every glance had significance she had yet to decipher. Donald remained at the edge of perception, not demanding, not instructing, but observing. His presence exerted gravity, compressing the space between awareness and consequence. Pearl sensed it instinctively. She did not lean away. She did not posture defensively. Instead, she acknowledged the tension without verbalization, allowing her instincts to navigate the delicate boundary between autonomy and influence. The moments accumulated, subtle and rapid. A hand placed incidentally near hers on the console, a tilt of his head that suggested calculation beneath casual observation, a pause, fractionally longer than necessary while her movements went unchecked. These were not conscious overtures. They were tests of equilibrium, an exploration of the line where restraint meets reaction. Pearl, perceptive and cautious, recognized them for what they were. The culmination was neither dramatic nor planned. It emerged naturally as consequence of proximity and observation. Her back brushed against him while examining a detail of the environment. Her pulse accelerated, not with panic but with acute awareness. He did not flinch. He did not redirect. The stillness held weight. The space contracted. The unspoken rules they had navigated so carefully began to bend under their own gravity. Pearl felt the subtle recalibration immediately. Awareness sharpened. Every sense heightened. She could detect infinitesimal changes, the shift in his breath, the quiet adjustment in posture, the minuscule tension of muscle under fabric. He remained deliberate. She remained deliberate. Yet the deliberate actions were no longer enough to maintain distance. The equilibrium had shifted. Donald recognized the same phenomenon. He was accustomed to control, yet proximity here had introduced a variable he had not quantified fully. Pearl's presence was no longer passive. Her independence and attentiveness had created friction that demanded engagement beyond observation. He remained restrained, but awareness had transformed into consideration, calculation into anticipation. The space between them became charged with intention unspoken, momentum unregulated. A deliberate movement, her glance catching his at the precise moment a faint smirk appeared, signaled recognition of mutual awareness. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The accumulated tension, the precise observation, the calibrated restraint had already communicated volumes. Pearl's training in discretion, self-regulation, and situational comprehension allowed her to navigate the night without collapse. She maintained poise, yet she was conscious that the existing boundaries were fragile. Each gesture was now amplified by context. Each pause carried implication. Each interaction was significant, even if subtle. Donald continued to operate in calculated silence. He recognized the precariousness of the moment. The boundaries established by the contract were now insufficient. Any overt action risked exposure. Inaction risked loss of control over the very dynamic he had orchestrated. Yet restraint had become its own language, a negotiation of proximity, influence, and observation. Time, compressed by intensity rather than chronology, reached its apex. An almost imperceptible shift, a hand brushing along the console in alignment with hers, culminated in a moment neither had allowed themselves to anticipate. Pearl did not withdraw. Donald did not seize. The night demanded acknowledgement rather than acquisition. Boundaries, once rigid and imposed, were now permeable. The implications were immediate. Neither could claim innocence, nor complete control. The night had rewritten the rules without consent. The equilibrium, so carefully maintained for weeks, had been altered permanently. The lessons learned in silence, structure, and observation had now collided with consequence. Pearl recognized the significance. This was not about desire, nor about surrender. It was about exposure to a force she had not predicted, an awareness that calculated distance could no longer prevent proximity from exerting influence. Every instinct aligned toward understanding the implications rather than resisting them. Donald recognized the same truth. Control, mastery, and precision were no longer sufficient. Presence alone had created tension that demanded adaptation. Any attempt to revert would risk destabilizing a dynamic that had become both fragile and potent. By the time the night concluded, clarity had emerged. Boundaries were no longer absolute. The contract had provided structure, and structure had guided behavior. Yet structure could not contain awareness, influence, or the subtle emergence of mutual recognition. The night ended quietly, leaving both Pearl and Donald fully aware that something had shifted irreversibly. Control had been tested. Restraint had been challenged. The equilibrium had given way. The unspoken rules that had governed their proximity had been rewritten in silence, without declaration. And both understood that the next decision would no longer be passive. Awareness had evolved into complication. The structured silence that had governed interactions between Pearl Moore and Donald Trust no longer contained the variables it had been designed to control. The equilibrium established through observation, restraint, and careful calculation had fractured under the weight of mutual recognition. Every decision now carried dual significance, both functional and personal, whether either acknowledged it or not. Pearl recognized the subtle shifts in herself first. Her instinctual independence, cultivated over years of self-reliance, now coexisted uneasily with heightened sensitivity to his presence. She noted the way her thoughts lingered on him long after proximity had ended, how her attention unconsciously anticipated his actions, and how the rhythm of her day adjusted without conscious choice. These were not fleeting curiosities. They were patterns that challenged her autonomy, patterns she had neither invited nor could fully suppress. Donald observed the transformation with measured calculation. His awareness of human behavior, sharpened by decades of strategic management, allowed him to recognize the emerging variable within his carefully maintained systems. He understood that attachment, subtle though it was, could compromise efficiency. Yet unlike most, he did not immediately attempt correction. Observation, analysis, and patience were often more revealing than immediate intervention. The risk became evident not through action, but through consequence. Their mutual awareness generated tension that could no longer be ignored. Each interaction carried unspoken weight. Each absence created expectation. Each proximity amplified implication. The dynamic between them was no longer neutral. It had become a calculated instability, a force operating alongside the contract without formal acknowledgement. Pearl felt the shift most acutely during moments of controlled observation. She noticed the way he adjusted posture, recalibrated distance, or allowed attention to linger. These were subtle indications that his perception of her had evolved beyond assessment into something more consequential. Recognition alone could have been harmless, but repetition and intensity compounded risk, introducing the possibility of disruption. Donald, in turn, noted her responses. She did not act with vulnerability, yet she did not resist subtle influence. Her independence remained intact, yet it now functioned in parallel with a rising emotional awareness he could not entirely anticipate. What he could measure was consequence. The contract, designed for strategic alignment, now had an emergent layer of unpredictability. He recognized that the equilibrium between autonomy and influence was delicate. Any misstep could produce outcomes beyond calculation. The environment amplified the tension. Every curated appearance, controlled exposure, and measured interaction reinforced the awareness between them. Outsiders interpreted alignment as proximity without insight into its emergent risk. Neither Pearl nor Donald could intervene overtly without destabilizing the perception that had been constructed around their shared space. The subtlety of the interactions became a hidden battlefield where restraint was strategy and awareness was leverage. Pearl's growing consciousness of the dynamic created an internal conflict. She valued control, yet she could not deny the physiological and cognitive responses emerging in his presence. Autonomy demanded rational disengagement, yet awareness compelled anticipation. The tension was not emotional theatrics but strategic complication, a scenario in which instinct collided with cognition and circumstance. Donald confronted a mirrored challenge. Experience had taught him that power rarely yielded unpredictability willingly. Yet here was an anomaly, a woman whose influence was unintentional yet undeniable. His instincts demanded recalibration. Emotional involvement, even subtle, posed risk to systems designed to maintain order. Every moment spent in proximity heightened that risk, yet observation without engagement had become insufficient. The balance shifted further during moments of enforced collaboration. Tasks requiring coordination highlighted their complementary capacities. Pearl's precision, insight, and adaptability intersected seamlessly with Donald's strategic oversight. Efficiency improved, yet so did awareness. Every collaboration underscored mutual recognition of competence, control, and latent tension. This was no longer merely structured proximity. It was functional intimacy with emergent consequences. By the end of the period, both understood the stakes. Awareness had grown into influence. Observation had grown into anticipation. The contract remained intact, yet it no longer contained the emergent variable now fully active between them. Feelings, subtle and disciplined, had entered the equation. Neither had spoken. Neither needed to. Yet the implications were undeniable. To remain within the framework without adjustment would risk destabilizing outcomes that extended beyond personal interaction, influencing both perception and operational control. Pearl understood that maintaining independence would now require heightened strategic awareness. Her decisions, even when guided by routine or necessity, were no longer neutral. They carried weight amplified by perception. Donald understood that control, mastery, and calculated influence could no longer prevent complication. The emergent awareness required engagement or risked irreversible disruption. And in that realization, both acknowledged silently that their actions moving forward could no longer be guided solely by observation or restraint. The presence they had tolerated, measured, and controlled had transformed into something that demanded choice. The risk was clear, the consequence was unavoidable. And both recognized that the next move could redefine the arrangement entirely. The equilibrium they had maintained for weeks could not withstand exposure indefinitely. Information, subtle yet insistent, began to encroach on Pearl Moore's meticulously managed reality. What had once been contained by discretion and strategic alignment was now pressed against by forces neither had anticipated. The environment shifted, revealing cracks in the carefully structured perception. Pearl discovered the first indication through observation rather than announcement. Conversations around her, once neutral, now carried layers of implication. Associates glanced with calculated curiosity. Social analysts circulated speculation in ways she could not fully trace. Her family, though unaware of details, sensed that the delicate balance protecting their reputation was now conditional. The arrangement that had shielded them was no longer invisible. It was becoming a matter of negotiation. Donald recognized the signs before Pearl could articulate them. He detected shifts in behavior, the subtle redirection of attention and minor disturbances in influence. His experience allowed him to anticipate consequences that others could not perceive, yet even he understood that some variables, human perception, familial expectation, and unforeseen scrutiny, could not be controlled entirely. Awareness alone was no longer sufficient. The first confrontation arrived without dramatics. A conversation between her family members, a misinterpreted statement from a distant associate, and an inquiry from an outside observer converged to produce a situation that demanded resolution. Pearl realized, without relief, that her association with Donald Trust had implications far beyond private observation or strategic alignment. Simultaneously, she became aware of the subtle danger in misperception. Her decisions, previously contained within private boundaries, were now exposed to interpretation. Actions once considered neutral or pragmatic were potentially weaponized by perception. The arrangement that had provided protection had also created vulnerability, as invisible influence attracted attention from those seeking leverage. Donald acted decisively, though discreetly. He engaged with the emerging problem not with confrontation or coercion, but with calculated intervention. Communications were redirected, pressure points neutralized, access was controlled, external scrutiny was contained without exposing his involvement. The efficiency of his response reinforced Pearl's observation. Control did not require visibility. Power could operate invisibly, manipulating outcomes without spectacle. Yet intervention carried consequence. Pearl became aware of protective mechanisms without understanding their origin. Gratitude was complicated by uncertainty, as she could not attribute the resolution to action she could trace or command. Independence demanded clarity. Clarity remained elusive. The intrusion escalated when Pearl overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. The words, though indirect, implied that Donald's attention toward her was strategic, that her presence functioned as a variable within his broader calculations. The implication struck her sharply. She had been instrumentalized. Her agency, while real, existed within a context controlled by someone else's objectives. The revelation unsettled her more than confrontation would have. Knowledge of manipulation, even benevolent, introduced a calculus she had not anticipated. Decisions now carried dual dimensions, practical outcomes and personal alignment. Any misstep could compromise autonomy, reputation, or both. The balance maintained through discretion and structured interaction was no longer sufficient. Donald anticipated the reaction even before it fully manifested. He understood that perception of manipulation could generate distrust, even when intention was protective. The situation required recalibration, not overt correction but nuanced management. He observed Pearl's responses, measured hesitation, and subtle adjustments, noting patterns that indicated both awareness and apprehension. The stakes intensified as external forces probed further. Rivals, perceiving opportunity, attempted to exploit the situation indirectly. Misaligned perceptions threatened both image and operational integrity. Donald's network, disciplined and silent, neutralized the incursions. Pearl, however, now became cognizant of the precariousness of her position. She understood that proximity to him, while advantageous in protection, had introduced new liabilities. The tension between autonomy and influence reached its apex. Pearl recognized the necessity of balancing gratitude, independence, and perception. Donald recognized the need to preserve operational security while minimizing impact on her autonomy. Both understood that failure to act with precision could produce consequences neither desired. By the conclusion of the incursion, Pearl had internalized a critical truth. Protection carried responsibility, influence carried expectation, and proximity carried consequence. The arrangement, once a simple contract of convenience, now intersected with risk beyond the parameters of the original agreement. Donald, equally aware, acknowledged the emergent reality. Structure and discretion alone could no longer preserve equilibrium. Exposure had altered the dynamic, introducing urgency without violating the implicit terms of restraint. The truth had arrived uninvited, unannounced, and uncompromising. And both recognized that subsequent decisions could no longer rely solely on observation or controlled proximity. Engagement had become inevitable. The decision arrived not with confrontation but with clarity. Pearl Moore recognized that remaining within the carefully constructed orbit she shared with Donald Trust had become a liability she could not fully control. Her independence, hard-earned and fiercely guarded, now carried risk. Every gesture, every glance, every moment of proximity had consequences beyond her intention. Remaining would compromise autonomy, leaving would challenge stability. Neither option promised comfort. She withdrew, not abruptly, but deliberately. Absence became her instrument of agency. She receded from the calculated visibility that had defined their interactions. Engagement shifted from structured proximity to deliberate distance. The arrangement that had once provided protection and clarity was now suspended, leaving both parties to navigate consequences unassisted. Donald observed the withdrawal with measured awareness. Detachment was a tactic he respected, yet here it introduced instability. Systems that had relied on her presence now required adjustment. Observation alone could not preserve equilibrium. Intervention had been possible before, but absence demanded reassessment. He recognized the risk immediately. Without her engagement, variables became unpredictable. Pearl's departure was not dramatic. There were no declarations, no confrontations, no final statements. Her movements were subtle, her interactions minimal, her presence limited to necessity. Yet the impact was palpable. Networks adjusted. Influence channels recalibrated. Perception shifted. Those attuned to her presence sensed a void, and the absence itself became a signal, an unspoken declaration of autonomy. The emotional calculus for Pearl was complex. Independence demanded restraint, yet instinct generated awareness of Donald's reactions. Her absence forced reflection, revealing that proximity had introduced a tension she had neither anticipated nor managed. Walking away was not relief, it was confrontation with internal consequence. Her control remained intact, but it exacted cost in vigilance, anticipation, and consciousness of impact. Donald, constrained by propriety and discretion, responded similarly. His awareness of her absence heightened attention to detail. Subtle interventions ensured that external variables remained contained, yet the internal variable, her presence as influence, could no longer be manipulated directly. Observation sufficed for stability, but could not restore the equilibrium lost through withdrawal. Weeks passed in this suspended rhythm. Pearl's daily life proceeded with controlled independence, yet awareness of proximity remained acute. Donald's influence was present, invisible yet undeniable. Each interaction, though infrequent, carried amplified weight. Absence created space, but it did not erase the pattern that had emerged between them. The process revealed truths previously obscured by routine. Pearl recognized the limits of autonomy within proximity structured by power. Distance revealed clarity. Her decisions had significance not merely for herself, but for perception, influence, and consequence. Absence required calculation equal to presence. The act of withdrawal was itself an exercise in strategic alignment. Donald observed the evolution in Pearl with precise evaluation. Her independence, now expressed through controlled absence, confirmed traits he had already noted: discipline, foresight, and intelligence. Yet it also introduced unpredictability. Without proximity, influence could not shape outcomes directly. Indirect effects became primary, demanding constant awareness of the patterns she might generate autonomously. The tension between engagement and withdrawal intensified awareness for both parties. Pearl's autonomy now carried strategic implications. Donald's operational control now required recalibration. Neither could return to the previous equilibrium, nor would either desire it. The system had shifted permanently. Within this shift emerged a profound recognition. Walking away, though voluntary, generated consequences equivalent in gravity to engagement. Presence had been powerful, but absence was equally consequential. Both parties experienced the subtle pain of detachment, an awareness of mutual significance unacknowledged yet undeniable. Pearl reflected on the paradox. Stepping back preserved autonomy but introduced complexity. Remaining would have compromised discretion and independence, yet absence magnified awareness, eliciting anticipation and consideration she could not fully regulate. The cost of either choice was tangible, yet neither could retreat from consequence entirely. Donald, operating from experience, recognized the mirrored dilemma. Control, influence, and calculation could not negate consequence. Detachment imposed new challenges. Observation alone was insufficient. Any action required precise timing and subtle intervention. The system had evolved beyond simple management. It now required nuanced engagement. The awareness persisted beyond immediate interactions. Both Pearl and Donald understood the emergent truth. Their dynamic could not be suspended indefinitely. Withdrawal and engagement existed in tension, each influencing perception, consequence, and internal response. Walking away, while preserving independence, also solidified recognition. Influence and awareness could not be disentangled from proximity. By the conclusion of this period of withdrawal, both parties acknowledged silently that the next step would demand deliberate confrontation. Not confrontation of words, nor declaration of intent, but confrontation with presence, recognition, and consequence. The equilibrium previously maintained by structure, restraint, and distance had evolved into something far more intricate. And both understood with certainty that absence had clarified one immutable reality. Proximity, once reintroduced, would carry risk far exceeding that of remaining within structured containment. The return of proximity carried consequences neither Pearl Moore nor Donald Trust could ignore. Distance had clarified tension, exposed vulnerability, and sharpened perception. When engagement resumed, it did not simply restore the prior equilibrium, it transformed it. Structure, contracts, and restraint no longer governed interactions. What remained was raw alignment, mutual awareness, strategic recognition, and a subtle force neither could name but both recognized. Pearl approached the renewed presence with caution. Every instinct reinforced autonomy, yet the awareness of consequence was inescapable. Donald's attention, precise and deliberate as always, was no longer neutral. The subtle recognition that had emerged during distance now manifested in behavior. Proximity, calibration, and observation had intensified into deliberate connection. She noticed the imperceptible adjustments in timing, the way space shifted in anticipation, and the quiet insistence of presence that demanded engagement. Donald, in turn, recognized the evolution in Pearl. Independence, discipline, and discretion had never been merely characteristics. They were forces interacting with his own control, creating patterns beyond prediction. Her reintroduction into his sphere carried neither obligation nor formal agreement, yet it generated consequence. The dynamic between them had become self-sustaining, independent of contract, structure, or oversight. The emergent alignment was neither chaotic nor overtly emotional. It existed in parallel with their identities, reinforcing both autonomy and interdependence. Each action now held dual weight, practical and intangible. Decisions impacted environment, perception, and internal calculus simultaneously. The presence of one altered the other, yet neither was subsumed. This was not romance in its conventional form. It was a disciplined interweaving of awareness, consequence, and recognition. Pearl discovered that engagement without structure required heightened vigilance. Absence had sharpened perception, but proximity demanded active negotiation of unspoken influence. Every gesture carried amplified significance. Every pause, glance, or movement was measured against potential consequence. Independence was maintained through careful calibration, yet engagement itself introduced vulnerability she could not eliminate. Donald observed the same reality. Control, precision, and influence, previously sufficient to manage proximity, now required adaptation. The force of recognition between them could no longer be ignored or contained. Observation alone could not sustain stability. Interaction, deliberate and nuanced, had become necessary to maintain balance. This interdependence emerged in subtle routines. Shared space, collaborative tasks, and aligned attention became arenas where the unspoken awareness between them manifested. Coordination no longer relied solely on instruction or expectation. It relied on anticipation of competence, reaction, and restraint. Every interaction was simultaneously functional and formative, producing outcomes that could not have arisen from structure alone. Pearl recognized an unexpected truth. Autonomy and connection were no longer mutually exclusive. Presence, influence, and recognition could coexist without surrender, but required acute awareness and discipline. The cost of engagement was attentiveness, yet attentiveness yielded insight. Control, once external, became internalized, calibrated through observation, and expressed through deliberate choice. Donald recognized a mirrored phenomenon. Influence, previously imposed through subtle design, now required responsive engagement. Autonomy, previously a variable to be respected, now became an interactive force. The emergent dynamic demanded adaptation, patience, and precision. The tension between them no longer derived from uncertainty or restraint. It derived from awareness itself. Mutual recognition, unstructured and unconstrained by contract, had generated a subtle force that neither could deny. It was neither conventional affection nor dependency. It was influence, awareness, and consequence fused into a single trajectory. Both understood that this alignment carried risk. Exposure, miscalculation, or emotional misstep could destabilize equilibrium permanently. Yet both also recognized opportunity. Proximity without obligation created potential far exceeding what structure or contract could define. Engagement, disciplined and deliberate, had become both strategy and reality. By the conclusion of this phase, Pearl and Donald existed in a state neither fully controlled nor fully surrendered to. Presence had replaced structure, awareness had replaced contract, and engagement had replaced distance. What emerged was unspoken, unregulated, yet undeniable, connection defined not by agreement but by recognition. And both knew, in the quiet intensity of proximity, that the next moment would redefine what their connection truly meant. Beyond contract, beyond influence, beyond consequence. The culmination arrived unexpectedly, in a moment neither Pearl Moore nor Donald Trust had orchestrated. Months of observation, restraint, calculated engagement, and disciplined awareness had led them to this instant. A collision of consequence and clarity beyond structure, beyond contract, and beyond precaution. It began with proximity, not announcement. Pearl was reviewing documents, her attention precise and methodical, when Donald appeared at the edge of her space. No words were exchanged. His presence alone carried intent as it always had. She felt the subtle shift in gravity, the room condensed without movement, tension amplified by recognition rather than circumstance. Her instincts, honed through weeks of careful calibration, demanded caution. Yet something in the precision of his observation suggested inevitability. This was not request, it was consequence. Every breath, every blink, every micro-adjustment in posture communicated understanding that neither had voiced. He moved closer, still measured, still deliberate. Boundaries, once firm and regulated, dissolved beneath awareness. Pearl's gaze met his, and for the first time both acknowledged, silently, irreversibly, the magnitude of what had grown between them. It was no longer analysis, discipline, or strategy. It was resonance. Presence had evolved into recognition, and recognition had evolved into something that could no longer be contained. Donald's hand lifted, not hurriedly but with intent, brushing against hers in alignment rather than imposition. Pearl did not recoil. She did not hesitate. Awareness surged, a current neither could deny. It carried months of unspoken tension, lessons learned, tests endured, and vulnerabilities respected. In that fleeting contact, history and consequence converged. The kiss came not from impulsive desire but from the culmination of proximity, recognition, and undeniable force. It was measured, deliberate, and infused with the weight of everything unsaid. Pearl responded with equivalent awareness, controlled, conscious, and full of acknowledgement. It was not escape. It was understanding, not surrender, but recognition. In that instant, the months of calculation, observation, restraint, and distance crystallized. The kiss was more than physical. It was a statement of alignment, a testament to autonomy preserved within connection. It carried consequence without obligation, acknowledgement without surrender, and clarity without declaration. The room, the environment, and the world outside became peripheral. What mattered was singular, the convergence of two forces, independent yet interdependent, aware yet unbound. The kiss signified what words could never capture. They had navigated control, influence, awareness, and consequence, and had arrived at mutual recognition that transcended the structures designed to contain them. Pearl withdrew slightly, her gaze searching his, measuring intention, confirming autonomy. Donald's hand remained near hers, steady, deliberate, unpressured. Silence followed, heavy with acknowledgement. No dramatic declarations were necessary. The kiss had conveyed the entirety of what had evolved over months. For the first time, they were no longer constrained by contract, structure, or distance. They existed entirely in the moment, conscious of consequence, yet liberated by recognition. Influence had given way to awareness. Observation had given way to engagement. Presence had given way to alignment. The unspoken truth was complete. The kiss, once incidental, once functional, had become absolute in meaning. It was not beginning. It was culmination. It was the acknowledgement that what had grown between them was real, undeniable, and beyond interference. It carried weight not because of obligation, but because of consequence and resonance. As the night continued, they remained in proximity without haste or need for verbalization. Every subsequent gesture, glance, and movement was informed by the recognition of that instant. Nothing had been demanded. Everything had been understood. And in that quiet, deliberate awareness, Pearl Moore and Donald Trust understood the unalterable truth. The kiss meant everything because it had emerged from months of restraint, reflection, and mutual understanding, a force neither structure nor contract could contain. It was complete.